Okay, so I mean, I've been listening to Paul van der Klee's videos, and he's been discussing Tom Holland a lot, and listening through Paul van der Klee's video excerpts from Tom Holland talking about certain topics. And it's interesting because I mean, I find that those that's a way of thematically framing a lot of the problems that I have specifically, particularly been addressing, but sort of not perhaps framing it in that kind of in that broad thematic sort of thing. But I mean, in some sense, I think that that a lot of the perspective from Tom Holland there is almost implicitly is something that I basically presume. Although I think I have already entreated a lot of the problems which are loosely being described by Tom Holland. Um, I think at least philosophically or metaphysically addressed a lot of the specifics. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, he talks. I mean, the problem here is that they define Christianity much too loosely and broadly, where they are talking about it as a kind of as a movement, and they're generally including also kind of historical influence and things like that, and broad themes, and a lot of these things you could say are part and parcel of actually grappling with and digesting the mysteries within the Christian doctrine, uh, or that kind of obscure the way or that keep the way of the true Christian doctrine, and rendering a proper understanding of these things. And so, when he is talking about Nietzsche, I think, I mean, Nietzsche didn't understand his own philosophy very well, which is why he is exploring it through fiction. But I mean, I think I almost recapture Nietzsche as, in some sense, being closer to a proper synthesis of Christianity in some sense. And when Nietzsche is even talking about the God of the world, when Nietzsche is talking about the death of God, he doesn't say which God. He doesn't say that it's the Christian God or the God of the world. And when he is, and when okay, he does call it the Christian God, but what the Christian God that he's referring to, which I would argue is pretty much sort of the God in Catholicism, and the kind of the European feudal worldview and theological perspective, I consider that to be the God of the world. I think that that's what Europe did, is that it took the God of the world and it tried to have a worldly dominion in the image of a kind of, they fashioned a God of the world in the image of the true God, and at least then they had a kind of a system that had a kind of self-consistency. I still think, in terms of the actual height of the doctrine, it doesn't quite match up to it, and this is why we have precipitated a kind of the liberal, the development of a kind of a secular liberal, that I mean, that's where Protestantism, sort of is how do you manage the doctrine, because the doctrine is very sophisticated, and you end up having to have uh, a sharper distinction between, I mean, the division between church and state, but then also what kinds of secular frameworks you need installed in a state in order to, you know, uh, so I mean, I agree that, sort of the West could loosely be called Christian, or as part of a kind of line of ideological evolution that was fostered under the umbrella of some kind of, loosely speaking, or the generalization of some kind of the exploration of a Christian ethos or something like that. I mean, I think that there are also, on a spiritual level, you can see that Paul is almost talking from 2,000 years ago. He is setting up and lining up a lot of uh, these mysteries that will manifest through history and through a kind of a line of progression and development. But and in some sense, this is almost like a kind of the curse of the Holy Ghost, or this is the spirit of the Holy Spirit, which is essentially a kind of something to chide and school the spirit of man for punishing it for not precipitating a proper understanding of these things, then we are forced to confront this kind of drama when we don't have a proper understanding and we haven't laid out a proper structure that is capable of properly supporting the depth and sophistication of the proper understanding of the Christian doctrine. So anyway, so I mean, apart from that, let's say call it historical process, we see paradoxes and contradictions in our current contemporary modern political and ideological arena. And I'm just going to give my spin of my sort of very low resolution but summarized narrative, because I mean I've kind of gotten into some of these issues and I've tried to talk about them from the individual perspective of how to view these things. And I mean I just to contain it into a general summarized story, that essentially we need to have a justice system that is self-consistent and coherent, but we need a secular justice system that is not the same as the divine justice or a spiritual, religious sense of justice, which must be contested on the level of the individual in a kind of soft culture power structure, which is, allowed and supported by the framework of the state. So you need a secular justice system that allows for a kind of moral anarchy, so that there can be such a soft cultural power system that operates. And that would be like an open liberal society that actually gives people the freedom of conscience and the freedom of association to exercise freedom as they so choose. And you need to have a justice system that is sophisticated enough that can essentially tolerate intolerance, but also be very careful that it doesn't tolerate the wrong kind of intolerance that leads to at least toppling or threatening the secular order, because then you have the so-called liberal intolerance paradox. And so, it's not impossible to do these things. And also, you need a democratic framework that is subordinated to this, this mechanism of fixing this intolerance paradox, because then otherwise you kind of get the slow boil, slow corruption, sort of tyrannical takeover of things, and and people are trying to solve problems at the wrong level of analysis, as it were. They're trying to solve individual problems of the human condition through a kind of secular collective solution to a problem, and then and then the more that you double down on that corrupt way of trying to address that kind of problem, you end up creating perverse incentives. You end up creating a kind of ideology that fundamentally dehumanizes people's internal locus of control, psychologically cripples them. It gives them a slave morality, as Nietzsche would describe, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, and let me just say as well that this is also a practical imperative, because if we don't, first of all, we need to be protected from through our justice systems. Because if we're not protected if the individual freedom of conscience is not protected through their justice system, if they're not given a constitutional right of administrative action, a just administrative action, that they have a constitutional right of just administrative action, when they get fired from work because of X, Y, Z, if we don't have these kinds of protections in place, then it doesn't even so matter that the state is not going to be the one destroying you, but what we're going to deal with is that the big corporations are going to end up becoming a tyrannical force. That essentially you're going to have a soft power that has congealed into such a static state, like and in some sense, soft power like this is perhaps hyperbole, but it's a good enough illustration. It's a good enough way to. but this is what we need to protect against: is that each individual in each liberal democratic society needs to be essentially protected by their own judiciary, by their own justice system. And if they are protected by their justice system, which I believe is an absolute necessity, it's that justice system that needs to essentially protect them from tyrannical or authoritarian forces from overseas, not even from in their own political situation, but essentially, if China, for instance, doesn't like the decision that a judge makes in a court case, they can put that judge on a list and say, we're going to put personal sanctions against you because we don't like your judgments. So you need nations to stand up for their own justice system, to say that no, well, you might not like that some of our individuals criticize your country, but we have freedom of speech in this country, and so you can't just put pressure on the companies in our country to fire that person, to make them, to non-person them, to have their bank accounts removed. You can't just use your soft power behind the scenes to crush dissent, because we actually preserve a free society, and we preserve individual freedom, and we don't, as diplomats, as politicians, that you might be complaining to China, although you might have more power than us geopolitically, we are essentially at the mercy of our own judges and our justice system. We can't override our own judges and our justice system. Our justice system protects individual liberty, and there's nothing that we can do in order to, so essentially you need the politicians to be powerless, because liberty is entrenched in the justice system. And you have to have that kind of integrity inside the legal system, so that on the macro scale of nations, then nations can all band together and say, well, if you try to punish us for having essentially integrity in our justice system, that we will protect each other. We'll band together. That what you do to victimize one of us, you do to all of us. What you do to one liberal democracy, you do to all of the liberal democracies. And you need that kind of unity, but in some sense the unity doesn't even matter if you don't have integrity in your own justice system. Because if it is not a question of justice, it's not the rule of law that just automatically would operate, and that if the politicians are responsible for crafting the standards, the moral standards which are enforced judicially, then you've got to break down of this, because then you don't even have a properly coherent, self-consistent, open liberal society through which that you can even protect and preserve and maintain and conserve liberal freedoms. So illiberalism is going to creep in, and through either, so you need to make a system. I mean, I'm using China as the example here, but it doesn't have to be China. It can be a local oligarchy. It can be a local cartel of big tech companies that want to control thought and manipulate public opinion, and will go after dissidents, and will go after people who break their narrative and destroy them. The proper protection is not the politician. The proper protection must be the judge. And so you need a justice system that is independent enough to be able to conserve its own fundamental values and protect itself against the liberal intolerance paradox, which means that you need more rights for the individual, and you need it to be these things are complicated. If you read my version of the hate speech bill, you kind of get, I need to make that available. I need to make another, because I've got one where it has my full legal name and my identity number written in it, because I submitted it as a public comment. Anyway, but I'll just remove that information. But I mean, look, it might require some specialized knowledge to sort of to wade through that. But I think it shows, legal jurisprudence is complicated. That's why judges are, they're specialists. They have to be methodical. They have to have a lot of analytical capacity to hold complicated principles and know what is more important than other things in order to render proper reasoning about, to keep the principles intact. But you also have to have a system that has enough values and principles that isn't relying on a democracy to, judges should not be parsing the intention of the legislature, should not be parsing the intentions of the legislature. The law itself needs to be independent enough that it can even reject what the legislation is trying to do, because it does not live up to a proper system and structure and coherence of that essentially that there needs to be secular principles and values that are at least broad enough to entrench an open, liberal, uh, you know, secular, free society. Um, and in our current historical thing, we can see the threats to all of these structures. And quite frankly, democracies are not designed uh, to be responsive to these things. And even if they could be responsive to these things, it's quite frankly, it's dangerous to put it in the hands of the democracy. This is what the republic should do. This is what the Constitution should lay down. It should lay down enough substantive values and principles, and there should be enough, or you like to be in a legal theory, in a legal framework in jurisprudence where the whole law itself is meant to be consistent with itself, coherent, and structured, um, so that you actually have the rule of law in your society. Um, so that someone could actually anticipate if their actions would lead to a certain amount of liability or breaching the law or something like that. It's that kind of certainty that allows people to maximize their responsible use of freedom. And within such a structure, I think that we could have a stable kind of human flourishing and progress, although it's by no means assured. But one can be hopeful that then, in such a system, that we would make progress constantly, essentially, as much as progress is possible. And I think a lot of that progress needs to not happen on the level of rules and collective morality, but on the level of individuals, um, and let's say a living culture, as it were, and people having a proper ambit of their own um, capacity to operate as agents, and that the structure itself fundamentally respects their agency and accords it the right amount of dignity. And um, anyway, and America has defects in its structure, um, but practically we can see how, even if you're free from tyranny from the American government, you're not necessarily free from tyranny from the Chinese government, who might, you can see how, um, what is it, sort of, they've got sports people because of Chinese deals or something like that with basketball or whatever, sports people that can't even exercise freedom of speech about some things because they are essentially, they are owned. And that soft power, I think, look, you can say, well, they consensually gave up those sorts of things. They did it for money. They sold themselves for that. But it's that is a, well, I guess it just has to do with having a kind of a fundamentally incommensurate. If we're not serious about the liberal intolerance paradox, and really the full extent of what that structural problem, to the full extent of thematically what that structural problem entails, and we don't have a structure that has enough integrity to counteract it, and directly confront it and overcome it, then divided we shall fall, and we shall, in a divided way, we shall fall to the soft power of oligarchs or authoritarians, wherever they may be. And yeah, so, and I mean, I've also tried to explore this on just getting into the mechanics of this in terms of the moral metaphysical mechanics of this, from, in terms of, the role of the state, the role, and the individual, and how this is better for everyone, at least in my proposed vision of how to tackle these things, is that the rule of law is the solution to these things. But there's good reason why people don't like the rule of law, is because it calls them on their, because when you have a system that is properly characterized as properly having the rule of law, then there's a different tone in the culture. I do believe that culture is downstream of the legal framework. And America has, if people will forgive me, it has a kind of liberty, it has a kind of liberal spirit, which is itself, I think, has a liberty towards a kind of iniquity. It has a liberty towards a kind of sadistically edged, sort of troll nature, that because essentially morality, or at least accountability, is known to be vested in the democracy, is known to be vested in the rule of man. And so there's this idea that we're still experimentally working towards how to bring people, to make people accountable and responsible for things. And this is a kind of collective moral conjuring. This is, that we're collectively constructing the moral narrative of an objective morality, or perhaps not of an objective morality, but of, in terms of the sociological enforcement of morality, that is a collective enterprise. And that makes morality, or accountability itself, that makes justice itself, a kind of a strangely collective relativistic, or collective subjectivism. And that is fundamentally nihilistic on some level. I think people know that is just for the concept of justice. You have to have a kind of nihilism just to utter the word justice, when that is the underpinning structure that leads to it. That, I mean, maybe the justice system does have some good ideas and some good principles in it, but those are just almost the accident of what the politicians have managed to inculcate within the system, or capture within their intention of their legislation. But that the system is always kind of groping towards some experimental, sort of trying to evolve itself there, whereas it'll never reach it, because you have to already begin with the mentality that you're trying to create a complete system. You create a complete system that maybe has some weak legal tests in it, and then those legal tests can be refined, but you have to have a complete set of principles and values and proceed from there. If you don't start from a conceptual framework of completeness, it's just, and this is, interestingly enough, I've made this observation before, I'll make it again, this is the whole corruption in so-called Christianity, where you get the kind of that vicarious redemption, where we'll never reach the perfection of Christ. It's all this false doctrine that somehow, to be a Christian is to always be trying to be a Christian, but never actually being as good as Christ. Where, if you actually read the scripture, if you read the doctrine, I don't know where that stuff comes from. It is just, you know, where that narrative propagated. I mean, I would say that it propagated because people have conflated Christianity with whatever the West has been sociologically doing, and essentially because justice has taken on this subjectivist relativism approach and this experimental approach, and all these things have sort of been merged, that you get this fudged view of things. anyway, and I think that now we're at the point in history where these contradictions have a manifested form for us to tackle, and so the practical challenge is there, and the practical challenge, I think, is almost the full depth and scope of the ideological or structural challenge. And so, I want to bring this up as an intellectual concern, but I think that it's useful that I can, use it in China and soft power and oligarchs and authoritarianism. That you can almost see it in politics. So we've got a political conundrum, we've got a political situation which has all these deep themes laden into it, and I'm just trying to be the voice of my candidate solution to these problems. So we need a coherent justice system. We need self-consistency and coherence. And the South African legal framework is really the model framework to follow. The South African system has been institutionally corrupted by the personnel that have been implanted or politically planted in it in order to subvert the structure. But that is an overt betrayal of the structure. The structure is not wrong. The structure is the solution to everything that we're going through, which is also what makes what's happening in South Africa all the more interesting. I do think South Africa has generally controlled the trend of history in recent times. Thematically what has happened in South Africa has been imitated or mimicked all over the world. It has been the ground zero of creating the future, as it were. And in some sense, I see it. This is the center of the world, thematically speaking, politically speaking, spiritually speaking, and I think liberty will be won or it will be lost on the soil in South Africa. That what happens here will be. That's a strange claim to make, but I think that we are living the future, and we are 2 chapters at least ahead of everyone else. But just in terms of the clarity of what's going on, the resolution of what's going on, it's not. There's no other place where it's happening in a more profound and deep way, in a more you can see it clearly for what's going on. It's in the starkest terms. It's starkly happening in South Africa first, and this is also why I think it's it's interesting how I think the rest of the world, they don't realize this, perhaps, that they are catching that they thematically are being affected downstream of what's happening in South Africa. But in terms of the symbolic power, like South Africa is where the coherence of liberty was insidiously undermined and subverted and institutionally corrupted. And until that gets rectified, until that sort of politically or ideologically gets cleaned up, I don't think, as a beacon, as a symbolic beacon to the rest of the world, I don't think, let's say, the spirit of libertarianism is going to be revived to some degree. South Africa modeled the corruption of these things, and not as if there isn't some obviously there's feedback and some cross-pollination, but I do think that South Africa is basically ground zero for these things, and if the trend is going to be reversed, and if something different is going to happen, I think if there's a solution to it found in South Africa, that will be magnified. I think that lesson learned will be the starkest lesson and the strongest points to be made on the subject. Sorry, I'm not very clearly describing this point, but uh, just all the ideological ingredients to everything that's happening. It's happening in the most extreme case in South Africa. In terms of the argument that the ideological um, schism is at its most poignant in South Africa. Anyway, okay, that's just a summary of everything I guess I've been talking about in these long hour recordings that I've made all over the place. Getting into the minutiae, that's sort of the it's just to try to make a contextual guide for these things. Okay, this is going to be an addendum that's going to get into two things. One is going to be the specific political situation around Taiwan, because I think I have something to elaborate on that issue, which maybe hasn't been spoken on that much by other commentators, and then also I'm going to talk about more general abstract themes to do with the culture war, and these are somewhat different topics, but they sort of compound into the title of this recording, which will be something about diagnosis or survey of the zeitgeist. So the reason why Taiwan is such an important issue is, in some sense, to do with the internal politics of China and the potential future in which China has more liberty, more freedom, more democracy. I believe that China's targeting of Taiwan, look, what I'm about to say is half true or true and not true, or whatever. It is true that there is a strong sentiment for the unification of China, and for Taiwan to be considered part of China. That is a real sentiment which has historical reasons. But I believe that the government of China is feeding into that sentiment, but also they have other desires, they have other designs as to why it's pertinent that Taiwan be crushed, essentially, because it is an ideological source of future pressure against their model of governance. In the future, if Taiwan remains to be a model of an ideological alternative to mainland China, and mainland China starts to suffer the tensions and the problems which I have already predicted, China is destined for, which is that when you have a centralized authoritarian governance that is essentially costly, and when you stop being a developing country and you start being a middle income country, the thing that is gating you away from further growth is essentially having institutions with integrity and having a proper justice system and court system that you can actually rely on your contracts with people. You need sophisticated things, and when you have centralized authoritarianism that just kind of, where these structures fall to the wayside because they fall to the centralized power, and entrepreneurs are constantly having their intellectual property stolen by the state, and what the Hong Kong protesters complained about, the people farming that is done essentially by the coordinating class, the oligarchy, or the ruling caste of China, which is, they can only justify this if they continue the propaganda that it's for the national interest, it's for the interests of the collective. And usually the way to galvanize that and to cement that is that you have to collectivize around an outside enemy. And so following the Russian playbook is that what you give up when you have to carry the parasitic weight of an oligarchy is that you have to give up growth, and then what you substitute for the lack of growth and economic prosperity and progress is you give the people blind nationalism. You give them an imperative to have to follow the collective, essentially. You create some kind of aura of fear um, uh, 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 or necessity. And so you substitute growth and prosperity for nationalism and a kind of national identity that is under threat by foreign national identities. Okay, so China is very clearly setting itself up for that. They're very clearly moving in that direction. They are tightening the ideological screws on their ship, and so that it will weather the storms ahead, essentially. And if they don't crush Taiwan, Taiwan will internally be an embodied exemplification of an ideological alternative, and will grow to represent a kind of an internal critique against China's, because if Taiwan continues to be prosperous while mainland China growth gets slumped, that's going to cause an ideological opposition, which the ruling Chinese government would rather be done with, would rather not have to tolerate or cope with. Okay, so that is the real, and if you put it, and I would even argue that history has given this opportunity for freedom and liberty, because Taiwan, in some sense, never really wants to call itself independent of China because it considers itself to be the model of the real China, but that the China was taken over by an authoritarian government that the Chinese people do not deserve in some sense. So China, for its own historical ideological reasons, also doesn't want to claim itself to be completely independent of China. It certainly wants to be independent of the current CCP communist government of China. Okay, so I think that the best kind of status quo here is that China must live with Taiwan and must live must live in the shadow of Taiwan until Taiwan's democracy actually wants to unify with China, which obviously would only happen if China were actually properly liberal and federated, or had accountable governance. And so I think that that China deserves to be haunted by Taiwan, by the liberty in Taiwan, and it should not be allowed to crush this. And in some sense, so it is a reckoning into the future in terms of having an internal check against China's, I think, destined to be substandard and sloppy government, which probably plans to direct dissatisfaction of its own internal economics onto foreign scapegoats, and Taiwan will be an important counterbalance to perhaps certain excesses of, I mean, it won't be, look, I don't want to say that, but if Taiwan can survive, it is destined to perhaps be an ideological ingredient to the general synthesis and to solving the problem of tyrannical and authoritarian government. So I think that Taiwan is an important ingredient for the future, and for that very reason, for the far distant long-term future in China. And forcing China to have to live with Taiwan and live in the shadow of Taiwan, I think, is an important ideological check on keeping some kind of realism and accountability onto internal Chinese sensibility and things like that, political perspectives, and I think that that's also how Chinese aggression at the moment should be framed. It should be framed as that they are trying to take out an ideological competitor, because they are very clearly setting up to be 1984. They are very clearly setting up to uh, to create a reality bubble for their own political thing. Okay, and it's important for the world that China continues to have this reality check called Taiwan, because otherwise China is perhaps going to be more jingoistic. It is going to be emboldened to divert all of its internal tension into external skirmishes or other kind of weird projects. I mean, they might. I mean, that's perhaps slightly unfair to speculate on, because China hasn't done this before. China has only flexed its muscles through its soft power, through diplomacy, which one can already start to get chills when you have a system that simply does not care about civil liberties, that doesn't care about other people's freedoms. But do they not care enough to leave them intact when perhaps there might be anti-China political awareness in other countries, and perhaps I mean, this is what liberal politics used to do, is that you used to have marches for things that happened all over the world. But obviously, the liberalism in the West, because of identity politics and all these things, has really stopped the liberal project. It's quite so. Anyway, let me talk about this. So I just wanted to give some more descriptions as to maybe some of the psychological elements to the woke cultural revolution in the West. And it's very interesting how there is this preemptive projection and accusation which they levy on to their opponents, where they I saw a T-shirt recently that said, sort of stop trans genocide, which has so many layers of almost irony, but also sort of you really have to be quite incepted into like a surrealist world if you can tout a phrase like trans genocide. But it also belies and conceals, perhaps through this projection, the very, I mean, because I would call that the woke cultural movement itself is propagated around a concerted kind of genocide, at least in the diminishment of other people's culture. That the liberal culture, the classical liberal culture, is being genocided very conscientiously. This is being done incredibly targeted and intentionally, and the diminishment of sort of cultural freedoms. And I just want to talk about the atmosphere that amounts to creating this. And so, I just want to mention again, so, there's the global warming, man-made global warming narrative, which in my view is, this is completely confected. You don't hear about the climate scientists who go against this narrative because they don't last in their industry. They get fired, so they have to toe the line. Any polymath scientist that has read the literature has very interesting things to say, and also they won't speak out unless they're already retired. So you get people like Roger Penrose and other polymaths, people who invented the computer modeling math and software that all the climate science is done with, who say that all the modeling has been done, is not science. I mean, this is worse than pseudoscience, but also there's so many basic facts which don't comport with the man-made climate change model. The fact that we actually have, the reason why we have so little CO2, we actually have so little CO2 that it goes against, let's say, the world average in history. And the reason why we have so little CO2 is because we're coming out of a little ice age. And so the climate is colder than it should be, and we have less CO2 than we should have. and having more CO2 will probably be good for us, and it's probably not also causing man-made global warming. What's causing the warming is that we're coming out of the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, which was why Vikings, attacked Britain because they were because Europe was extra cold. But I mean, also let us not forget that climate always changes. I mean, climate has radically changed. I mean, just in the last 2,000 years, Egypt used to be the bread basket for essentially all of Europe. Egypt used to be incredibly fertile. Egyptian agriculture completely collapsed, and that was purely to do with climate. Climate has always changed. The idea that this is a man-made thing and that it's linked with CO2 is really, I mean, if you just look at ice core samples and you look at CO2 levels, it just makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so there's that kind of thing. There's the pandemic, but all of these narratives, the thing that they have in common is that they imply collective accountability, but also a kind of ideological incentive is created to identify a scapegoat. So you have these systemic narratives of a systemic pressure or a systemic threat. Global warming is threatening all of our lives. The pandemic is threatening everyone. So that and that we have to collectively be accountable for this. So we have to band together and all make ourselves evenly and equally invested into some kind of response or solution. And we have to identify the scapegoats of people that aren't conforming to the general solution. And so you get this kind of fear skepticism, which has this kind of lowest common denominator quality to it. And they have such a weak consensus on this kind of lowest common denominator, skeptical, that they get to hold the orthodoxy and the default that they can be skeptical about anything that breaks their consensus. And then they call people disingenuous for breaking their narrative, when it's, sort of their questions which are incredibly cherry-picked and dishonest. But also, the premise of the question just holds their narrative as sort of as having the coinage of being the default truth somehow. That anyone who disagrees with me just must automatically be disingenuous, but they can't hear their own dishonesty in their own question. That they haven't substantiated the premise that they're relying on in their question. And it's interesting because when they're framing other people as being racist, and they're calling them disingenuous, what is really happening is that their question is racist. They're asking a racist question, but then they are saying that you are racist by your disingenuousness, by not conforming to their orthodoxy. You are being disingenuous, and ergo, it's implied, or that that you're part of the systemic racism, because now you're not combating the collective, the systemic. You're not dealing responsibly with the systemic narrative. You're not taking on your burden of the collective accountability. And so, they get to sort of continually wield this collective accountability for the problem that must be sort of evenly burdened, and that if you try to find a different model of dealing with the problem, then you are the disingenuous one, rather than essentially having to substantiate their collective accountability framework or their systemic narrative. They never have to properly prove their systemic narrative. They just can continue to volley skepticism and holding it as the default or the orthodoxy. Whereas when they produce these volleys of skepticism, the volleys themselves are implicitly racist, are the presuppositions are very clearly racist. And they just never get called out on it. That the people who are holding the narrative essentially are the people who are bigoted or prejudiced or biased or, just plugged into a kind of self-referencing chauvinism, and, somehow they have the sanctimoniousness that is a kind of self-righteous given. And it's hard to dislodge these people from their moral high ground, but I think that what you have to really do is you have to turn it around on them, and you have to remind them that they haven't substantiated their presupposition, and that they are blithely creating essentially conjecture which is deeply racist itself. And you have to accuse these people of their moral opaqueness and overshooting, and that they are being immoral and essentially, but it's slightly strange because they're being immoral on a technical level simply because essentially they are acting as a kind of pedant of something that essentially their excuse is that there's a good enough consensus that agrees with them. I mean, that's at the end of the day is their excuse, is that there's a peanut gallery somewhere, there's a loose consensus of academics that all cover each other, that all amount to a consensus, and that's their excuse, essentially. That there's only a minority of discredited people who break rank with this groupthink. That at the end of the day is their only virtue. And sorry, this is so complicated. It doesn't, but essentially, this is where the kind of the fear, skepticism, and the lowest common denominator is a really disgusting way of distorting and dulling democracy, because everything becomes opaque, everything becomes a caricature of itself, everything becomes an oversimplification, because it's very easy to get skepticism to agree on criticism, to get skeptics to agree on detraction, on detracting from something that claims to stand for something. And it's obviously and then you also have a self-referencing position built in, because you can just put the onus on the person who's against your skepticism, and they have to prove a negative if you do that, because they have to prove that your skepticism is unfounded, when that's like literally having to prove a negative. They should first have to substantiate their position, which they never do. They just have a consensus, they have a groupthink instead of that. So this is a kind of mediocrity, a moral corruption even, which is like a hydra, and I think you have to take a firm stance against it. You have to morally name it. You have to call it immoral and corrupt, and you have to you have to put up the fence, as it were. You have to put up the wall to these people, to know, so that they know that that there is a line in the sand that you are going to essentially police from your side, and you are going to complain when they cross that line, and you have to show a kind of consistency in keeping that boundary up, because otherwise there is no they will kill you by 1,000 cuts. They will you know the attrition will be never ending, essentially. And and it's very interesting how they are deaf to the other perspective, how they are deaf to the alternative worldview. Sorry, I mean, I'm thinking in my head right now between John Steenhuisen being questioned by these journalists about the Phoenix DA election posters, by the DA election posters in Phoenix. And I mean, you can see the ideological blinders on these journalists using every trick in their dirty books and their narrative witchcraft and dark magic of essentially just continually using this lowest common denominator, fear, skepticism, to try to pigeonhole and to lambast the leader, John Steenhuisen. And I think that this was the only thing that he should have done, in some sense, is that he should have at some point concluded, as they continue to ply their disgusting narrative, is that their narrative is racist and that they are the racists, and that they are the ones who are essentially part of this scapegoating machine of ideological diversion and subterfuge, and that they are trying to dull democracy by essentially using the word racist to try to control and police the boundaries of political discourse, and they're doing so in some sense because they themselves are deeply racist, and they have a definition of racism which is implicitly racist, and and they are being dishonest about not even having to substantiate that framework. They just rely on it like a narrative, like it is just the default position of things. And this is essentially what is also happening in the man-made climate change. This is also what's happening in terms of sort of the pandemic, when essentially it's people that have overcommitted, like Australia, that has overcommitted to doing things in a radical way that is not sustainable, that in the end will be seen as an overreach because it was not necessary, because it also is not going to make a difference essentially to the numbers at the end of the day. But you have to continue doing more and more radical things in order to validate the faulty logic of your prior policy or public health policy and actions. So you get stuck into a sunk cost fallacy, essentially. And this is what happens when you've been following the emotional logic, and there hasn't been coherent reasoning behind any of your moves that you've been making. But you have to kind of upkeep and follow the commitments that you have made. The soft implied commitment is that vaccines can somehow bring about the elimination or eradication of COVID-19, where it's not. No one has said that, but it is implied. That's like the loose logic that underpins all of this stuff. That somehow, well, if we don't, somehow just increased vaccinations are going to sort of generally be better. I think that that's even dubious. If more people had the virus authentically and gained proper or more robust immunity uh, to all the proteins and not just one of the proteins, which might not even still be in some of the variants, you'll probably have a much more resilient um, herd immunity in the long term. And this virus is going to mutate, obviously. It's a COVID virus, which is also why we never developed vaccines before for a COVID virus. But anyway, this and it's interesting because I guess the kind of the fear skepticism that you have to stoke and encourage in order to keep the collective narrative, the systemic narrative and the collective accountability alive, it gets more and more of a leap. It gets more and more outrageous. Um, and no one even makes the full positive argument. No one even tries to substantiate it. It just becomes a kind of, oh, well, that's obviously part of the scientific consensus that's backing all of this. And it's always just assumed, and it's never rendered. It's never manifested in view. You know, it's so obvious it's not even mentioned. That's how the collective accountability systemic narrative is defended. This is why these uh, woke people, the academics, they can't ever debate their point and worldview properly. They always have to turn it into a kind of comedy stand-up routine where they have to make fun of the opponent because somehow they already don't get it. Essentially they're not already part of the bandwagon. They don't already believe and are plugged into the groupthink, and therefore the joke's on them. That you have all of this skepticism and all of this lowest common denominator sort of consensus, sort of hydralisk amalgamation of collateral intellectual support. That the light of self-reference does not shine and keep you warm. It's it's really scary to see just how many people are willing to fall for this unprincipled and vacuous worldview simply because it essentially it shores up, it secures a very narcissistic way of relating to other people, because you can just kind of always flex this vulnerable narcissism as long as you can say, oh, you're threatening me, that I have the skeptical fear and you're not being sympathetic with the skeptical fear, therefore you are the disingenuous one. You you need to excuse yourself, and then you need to get in line for not already being in line. It's a very lazy intellectualism, and you can see that the people who espouse it and who rely on it are deeply bigoted people fundamentally. They're intellectually and morally corrupted, very fundamentally sadistic, antagonistic people, using a narrative in order to perpetrate a very kind of vindictive, their whole mentality is based on a kind of group-based retributivism, of a kind of zero-sum game of representation of a kind of group identity and moral consideration that is vested in the group. These are people who are fundamentally racialists at their core, and I do think that that's the only thing missing from the DA message, is that these people are not being that their ideology, although the DA represents an ideological alternative to them, has not, mean, they have done it thematically and abstractly, but as I say, like the journalists, those journalists, I think, could have been called disgusting racialists, and that, uh, and when they use the word disingenuous, you can say, well, you're being dishonest and you are a racist. Your question is racist, quite frankly. You know, is that kind of juxtaposition um, of the moral perspective and the moral landscape. Uh, anyway, this is an addendum, so I mean, yeah, I mean, this is not easy to describe. I mean, it just, shows the difficulty of this kind of issue where I'm encouraging someone to take more of a stand, where I'm not even giving a very particular example of how one would make such a stand or disagreement. But essentially, after being called disingenuous by a journalist, by an interviewer, or something like that, I think that it does behoove one to say something like, your questions, I've properly answered your question. Now you are dishonestly asking me more race-baiting questions, like your prior race-baiting questions, where I have essentially addressed the presupposition that the question is based on, the racialist and racist presupposition that it's based on, and now you keep on plastering further. You're basically asking me the same question. You're proposing the same narrative, and you're calling me disingenuous. That's a obviously I disagree with your worldview, and I think that you are the racist. You have to kind of make that stand at some point, and you have to say, look, your questions are now essentially dishonest. I have answered the fundamental presupposition in your questions, and now you're just asking me more of the same race-baiting questions, and after I've given you proper answers to them. Obviously, I don't believe in your worldview, and I think that your worldview is racist. And for you to pretend to ask questions like this is kind of dishonest, because you're essentially asking me the same question, which actually amounts to something like, will you concede that I hold the moral high ground, and that you are just a closet racist? Is essentially the implicit accusation, is part of the paintbrushing that is being done by the journalist, him or herself. There were actually two journalists. I think one was female and one was male, and they were both sort of taking turns, taking their pot shots of asking the same race-baiting questions. And at some point, if you don't turn it around on the so-called journalist, then you just make your whole platform. You have to leverage you have to demarcate the territory, and you have to defend your line, as it were. And the leader of the opposition, John Steenhuisen, I think did a fairly good job on the substantiation of his answers to the questions, but he never fought back. I mean, thematically, you could say that he did, but I would say that to bring it home, you actually have to leverage it in terms of how there is real dishonesty that's going on there. There is a real conflation and sort of this isn't an unreasonable way to ask questions. Is that you're essentially you're plastering someone with the same polemic, with the same narrative that you have already properly answered that worldview. And obviously you disagree with that worldview, and you have but in some sense you haven't connected the dots that the person leveraging these questions is essentially being an ideologue, partisan racialist, and that their questions themselves are disgusting questions that are causing racial division. So, it's ironic that they are there saying that you are inflaming racial divisiveness because you're not accepting the narrative and the premise of the question, which is fundamentally racist and seeks to generalize and collectively scapegoat a whole community, which was in some sense the whole point of the DA election posters, which was the ANC called you racist, the DA calls you heroes. And that was in some sense meant to say, we're not going to be divided by ANC racialist rhetoric, even as they try to pretend and they pay some lip service to non-racialism, as they are blatantly anti-non-racialists, and they are playing a very cunning game of ideological inception and subterfuge, and and they want to have their cake and eat it, and they have their hypocritical journalists promoting their disgusting racialist ideology. And all the people who complained about these posters very clearly misinterpreted them on purpose so that they could continue to use this diversionary and divisive tact. It's utterly disgusting. But in some sense, it doesn't get brought home until you actually turn it around on the person who is leveraging that kind of race baiting. And I mean, it's obviously it's not easy to point at people who are doing it, because then essentially they can then use it to narrate their unilateral systemic oppression narrative. They can use it as they can go full activist mode. You can trigger them into some kind of violent outburst, which then like they can justify as that because what is it the ideological violence on their fascistic racialist position. Like they can't let people actually countermand and openly contradict their disgusting racialist narrative. So I mean, we really need to have our leaders mounting that kind of. We have to press up to the precipice. We have to, if we don't do it, we're just constantly taking pot shots. We're constantly, it's like bucket, because they just do it until they win, but they never, like it has to be. There has to be some kind of counter. It has to be brought to a head so that it can be made a political focal point, so that people can see it as a watershed, but also to know what side of the fence that they're on in terms of that issue, in terms of how that comes down. Because that is the mechanism that they are using to get their lowest common denominator, fear, skepticism, and consensus. Like if you don't challenge how that groupthink consensus works, you are always just kind of scrounging for people who already get it on some level, but you're not going to convince anyone that's anywhere close to the borderline, because in some sense you're saying that all the people who are in this kind of that has this strategy of using this fear, skepticism, and always then playing with awarding themselves as self-referencing moral self-righteousness and sanctimoniousness, all of those people are going to stick like glue to the cultural hegemon, because in some sense you're not challenging that toxic racialist cultural hegemon. And although that you might substantively counteract their narrative, you have to indict the acolytes of that narrative. Otherwise, you don't. There's not an effective. Let's say, alternative or mode of people aren't going to be comfortable, because in some sense, if they then support you or your position, they are going to feel that they are going to have the similar kind of ideological bucket fishing happening against them. And I mean, yes, there are some people in the DA who are sensitive to this, because they basically believe in the identity politics stuff. They don't get it yet, and in some sense, they only respect pure cultural power. They only respect the mob, and they want to be on the right side of the mob. I mean, a lot of these this is why people get into journalists, is because they always wanted to kind of be sort of, they wanted to rub shoulders with the rich and the powerful, and they want to be part of crafting the cultural narrative, and they want to sort of be activists and sort of luminaries and visionaries themselves, and they see journalism as a way to get their opinion elevated in some sense. And so, and especially now with this toxic identity politics, you've got a whole slew of people who are essentially, I mean, you can see this all over the place. I mean, you can see this on public talk radio. There are people who will not go against fashion. They will not go against the fad, because these are people who are incredibly insecure about, they don't have an independent intellectual bone in their body. They like grandstanding and they like being the luminary, but in some sense they always believe that there's some kind of groupthink or consensus that they are either cheerleading or heralding or one of the vanguard thereof. And in some sense, that's why they croon towards movements which have a kind of, as I say, like a kind of fear, skepticism, consensus, because that is how you can safely embed yourself in a movement or in an intellectual, I mean, these are people who are not sophisticated intellectuals. These are people who are, what are they? Good weather fans or fair weather fans. These are people who, I mean, and sadly, a lot of the population is like that, and they need watershed cultural moments. They need to see that individually you can be indicted for being an acolyte of this ideological filth and promoting this narrative, and just the excuse that there is a consensus, that it's controversial to go against this consensus. As soon as those excuses are respected even by the people who are on the other side of the ideological fence as holding some currency, then you are going to, I think, automatically lose a great section of the population, because you're not alerting them to the fact that they are themselves dirtying their hands in a kind of moral corruption by being involved with this groupthink. And we need examples of people indicting individuals who promote this disgusting lowest common denominator, groupthink, sort of fear, skepticism, and so when you see two journalists trying to bludgeon or cudgel the leader of the opposition with this kind of disgusting race baiting and their own racialist questions, and when they are properly answered, and then they just ply more and more of the same type of questions that have the same disgusting presuppositions that have already been contradicted. It's a partial win because John Steenhuisen didn't capitulate on the substantive issue, but I would argue that he didn't fight back in a requisite way. And I mean, I'm not making this, I'm not trying to be critical at all. I'm just pointing this out because because it needs to be, sort of underscored as the natural next step in properly tackling the ideological evil that these people represent, and also the democratic illiteracy that it essentially guarantees and underpins. Because if we're going to continue to be beholden by these disgusting opinions and these disgusting beliefs, by these journalists, if they're going to go unindicted and unchallenged, then we are going to continue to see our institutions boiled alive in the democracy frog is going to be beyond being saved from the boiling pot. And we're going to continue to see institutions like the South African Human Rights Commission be used by these racialist demagogues and by their, by their acolytes and their network of ideological racialists. And they're going to get away with masking their racialist worldview and their disgusting racist sentiments as anti-racism. Anyway.